Do you have a right to expect a benefit to keep flowing towards you based on past treatment? In the previous video, we saw international human rights law set standards of non-discrimination, equality, and state obligation. India follows the dualist position. Yet the Supreme Court in certain PIL cases vigorously applied international law to the case on hand, regardless of the doctrine of transformation. Hence, the SC drew from international human rights law in the following PIL cases: as an aid to constitutional or statutory interpretation, either generally or in order to resolve an ambiguity; as a relevant factor in the exercise of a discretion conferred by legislation and to interpret the law to reflect international changes; as an aid to constitutional or statutory interpretation, either generally or in order to resolve an ambiguity; as a relevant consideration to be taken into account in the exercise of a discretion by a decision maker and thus subject to judicial review; as a relevant factor in the exercise of discretion conferred by legislation and to interpret the law to reflect international changes; and as a factor that may be taken into consideration in the development of the common law. As usual, we begin with a story, and here it is today. Army Welfare Education Society, New Delhi versus Sunil Kumar Sharma and others. Army Welfare Education Society, New Delhi versus Sunil Sharma and others explored whether the doctrine of legitimate expectation could be invoked in disputes between private entities and individuals, particularly focusing on the expectations of private school teachers regarding their salaries and benefits. Sunil Kumar Sharma and other teachers argued that they had a legitimate expectation to receive salaries and benefits equivalent to those of government teachers due to the nature of the institution's role and responsibilities. They claimed that the expectation arose from the established practice and representations made by the institution at the time of their employment, and that their expectations were reasonable and legitimate. Army Welfare Education Society contended that it was not a public authority, and thus the doctrine of legitimate expectation, which is a creature of public law meant to combat arbitrariness in executive actions, could not be extended to private contractual relationships. The court ultimately dismissed the writ of mandamus, reinforcing the principle that the doctrine does not extend to contractual relations between private entities and individuals. In incorporating international law principles into our jurisprudence through PIL, the Supreme Court made use of the doctrines of legitimate expectation and harmonious construction. What are these doctrines? How did the Supreme Court integrate international law into our domestic law, even though there is an existing gap in implementation in the law by the legislature? The answer to these questions is what we will be dealing with today. International human rights law may be used as a factor that may be taken into account when identifying the demands of public policy. The implementation of human rights treaties is binding on all state parts. The state policies would also have to reflect the other two key principles of non-discrimination and substantive equalities. A failure by the state to ensure this protection involves a breach of its international obligations and incurs the responsibility of the state under international law. Two of the concepts that would be used for drafting arguments against discriminatory policies could be the theory of legitimate expectation and the theory of promissory estoppel. The principle of legitimate expectation was transported from administrative law to PIL in Visakha versus State of Rajasthan. The Supreme Court, while drafting the guidelines on sexual harassment of women at the workplace, referred to many international conventions and norms which were relevant for the purpose of guaranteeing gender equality, right to work with dignity, and the adherence to Articles 14, 15, 19(1)(g) and 21 of the Constitution, including CEDAW and the Beijing Principles of the independence of the judiciary. Bhauri Devi was raped repeatedly by the landlords of the Gujjar community when she tried to prevent child marriage as a worker in the Rajasthan State Women's Development Program. several women's groups and non-governmental organizations filed a petition in the Supreme Court under the collective platform of Visakha. The Supreme Court of India stated that the international conventions and norms are to be read into fundamental rights in the absence of enacted domestic law occupying the field where there is no inconsistency between them. Making use of Article 73 that provides that the executive power of the Union covers matters that Parliament has power to make laws on, they obtained the consent of the state to formulate Visakha guidelines regarding sexual harassment at the workplace to be implemented until legislation is passed to deal with the issue. Invoking the case of the High Court of Australia and Minister for Immigration and Ethnic Affairs versus Teo, in recognizing the concept of legitimate expectation to incorporate international human rights standards into Indian law to construe the fundamental rights to guarantee and safeguard gender equality. They also relied on Nilabati Behera versus State of Orissa, 93, where a provision in the ICCPR was referred to make an enforceable right to compensation as a public law remedy under Article 32, distinct from the private law remedy in torts. Definition. The Supreme Court of India defined it thus in Confederation of Ex-Servicemen Association versus Union of India, 2006. The principle of legitimate expectation relates to the relationship between public administration and the individual. The principle elaborates the expectations raised due to administrative conduct that might have legal consequences. Such expectations may arise either from an express promise or from a consistent past practice that may reasonably be expected to continue with the applicant. In Council of Civil Services Union versus Minister of Civil Services, the GCHQ case, Lord Diplock in the UK put it another way. What a person has been allowed to enjoy by the authority concerned and which he can legitimately be expected to continue to enjoy until he has been informed of some rational reason for withdrawing the legitimate expectation which he has been permitted to commit. The Supreme Court of India described this doctrine in Ram Pravesh Singh and others versus State of Bihar and others as a person can be said to have a legitimate expectation of a particular treatment if any representation or promise is made by an authority, either expressly or impliedly, or if the regular and consistent past practice of the authority gives room for such expectation in the normal course. Thus, the Supreme Court, through various judgments, has developed this doctrine in order to keep a check on the abuse of administrative power by public bodies. The emergence in common law of the doctrine of legitimate expectation is generally traced back to Schmidt versus Secretary of State for Home Affairs, an England case. Two American Scientology students' applications to extend their study permits were rejected by the Home Secretary, leading to the beginnings of the theory. Lord Denning in the Court of Appeal stated that an opportunity had to be given to an alien if the leave given to him to stay in UK was being revoked before expiry of the time. In Attorney General of Hong Kong versus Ng Yuan Shu, 1983, the court required the government of Hong Kong to honor its undertaking to treat each deportation case on its merits. Council of Civil Service Unions versus Minister for the Civil Service, 1985, which related to alteration of conditions relating to membership of trade unions and the need to consult the unions in case of change of policy, as was the practice in the past. Other cases are R versus Secretary of State for the Home Department ex parte Ruddock, Findlay versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, and Breen versus Amalgamated Engineering Union. The development of the doctrine of legitimate expectation in India has been in line with the principles evolved in common law English courts. In fact, it was from these English cases itself that the doctrine first came to be recognized by the courts in India. In India, this doctrine was first applied in the case of State of Kerala versus K.G. Madhavan Pillai, 1988, wherein the Supreme Court held that a plaintiff had a right to sue for breach of contract. In this case, the respondents were given permission to open a new aided school and improve the current ones. But that permission was put on hold 15 days later by another order. The respondents filed an appeal against this order on the grounds that it violated their rights to due process of law, that is, they did not get a fair hearing. The Supreme Court concluded that respondents had a legitimate expectation of protection under the sanction and that the second order was contrary to natural justice. This doctrine was applied by the Apex Court in several cases, including Navjyoti Co-op Group Housing Society versus Union of India, Union of India versus Hindustan Development Corporation, MP Oil Extraction versus State of MP, and National Buildings Construction Corporation versus S. Raghunathan, and several more. It is a principle of administrative law that government decision makers should be required to fulfill the legitimate expectations that they have created. Where a decision maker has failed to satisfy a legitimate expectation in the process of arriving at the decision may be challenged. The main role played by the courts in enforcing this doctrine is to safeguard the individual's expectations in the face of change of policy. At its most basic, a legitimate expectation claim is based on the assumption that where a public body states that it will or will not do something, a person who has reasonably relied on that statement should be entitled to enforce it, if necessary, through the courts. For a legitimate expectation to arise, the public body's statement must be clear, unambiguous, and without qualification. Interference with legitimate expectations may be justified on public policy grounds. The doctrine is adjacent to the rules of natural justice, non-arbitrariness, promissory estoppel, rule of law, and proportionality to check the abuse of the exercise of administrative power. The doctrine does not give scope to claim relief straight away from the administrative authority, as no crystallized right as such is involved. Legitimate expectation may arise if there is an express promise given by a public authority, or because of the existence of a regular practice which the claimant can reasonably expect to continue. Such established practice should be regular, consistent, predictable, and certain. It can be conduct, process, or activity of the decision-making authority. The administration must respect those expectations or provide reasons of public interest. The legitimate expectation is not a legal right. Such an expectation must be reasonable, which was held in Madras City Wine Merchants Association versus State of Tamil Nadu 1994. If legitimate expectation is not given due consideration by the public authority in a decision-making process, it violates the rules of non-arbitrariness, an essential concomitant of the rule of law. This was held in MP Oil Extraction and Another versus State of Madhya Pradesh 1997. In Hindustan Development Corporation's case 1993, legitimate expectation was delineated as follows. The principle of legitimate expectation gave the applicant sufficient locus standi to seek judicial review. The doctrine was confined mostly to a right to fair hearing before a decision which resulted in negativing a promise or withdrawing an undertaking was taken. It did not involve any crystallized right. The protection of such legitimate expectation did not require the fulfillment of the expectation, where an overriding public interest required otherwise. However, the burden lay on the decision maker to show such an overriding public interest. A case of substantive legitimate expectation would arise when a body by representation or by past practice aroused expectation which it would be within its powers to fulfill. The court could interfere only if the decision taken by the authority was arbitrary, unreasonable, or not taken in public interest. If it is established that legitimate expectation had been improperly denied on the application of all the principles that I stated above, the question of giving opportunity can arise if failure of justice is shown. In Army Welfare Education Society, New Delhi versus Sunil Kumar Sharma, decided on 9/7/24, the Supreme Court, in its judgment by Justice Pardiwala and Justice Manoj Mishra, clarified the essential features and limitations of the doctrine of legitimate expectation. Legitimate expectation must be based on a right. The court emphasized that legitimate expectation must stem from a right rather than a mere anticipation or hope. In this case, the teachers' expectation that their salaries and benefits would match those of government teachers was not based on any legal right or express promise. The basis of legitimate expectation. The court highlighted that such an expectation must arise from an express or implied promise or consistent past practice. The teachers failed to demonstrate that there was a consistent past practice or an explicit promise from the society regarding salary and benefits equivalent to government teachers. It is not based on sporadic or random acts. The court noted that the expectation cannot be based on sporadic or random acts. In this case, there were no established dealings or negotiations between the teachers and the society that would support a legitimate expectation. Applicability to public law matters only. The court reaffirmed that the doctrine of legitimate expectation lies primarily in public law, particularly in cases involving breaches of promise by public authorities. Since the society was a private entity and not a public authority, the doctrine was not applicable in this context. The requirement of established practice or promise. The court ruled that a plea of legitimate expectation must be based on established practice or promise. The teachers' claim lacked a foundation, established practices or statutory obligations that would require the society to maintain parity with government teachers' salaries. How did the SC break the barrier of a person having locus standi by having an expectation to be the petitioner in the Vishaka case when the right against sexual harassment is not recognized in civil law and when the instrument from which she draws the right is unenforceable in law? Even though this was not explained in detail in the Vishaka case, the reference to the TO case gives us an inkling of the surprising shift away from the absolute non-interference in policy except in the case of arbitrary unfairness to and the requirement for representation and show of detriment to substantive reasoning of examining policy to keep up with the demands of the governance and international changes. Let us take a look at the TO case. The TO case concerned a Malaysian citizen, Ah Heng Teo, who had lived in Australia since 1988, married an Australian and had 3 children with her. In 1989, Teo applied for residency in Australia, but before this application was decided, Teo was found guilty of criminal offences including heroin importation. Teo's application for residency was rejected on the basis that he could not fulfill the good character requirement. He applied for a review of this decision, letting in evidence that he was the only person who could keep the family together. The review was rejected by the Immigration Review Panel and the minister accepted the panel's decision and made an order for his deportation. Eventually, in the final appeal, High Court agreed that there had been a breach of natural justice stemming from the department's failure to invite Teo to make submissions as to whether a deportation order should have been made. The High Court found that due to Australia's ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Teo had a legitimate expectation that the decision maker would treat the rights of his children as a primary consideration. Here, as in the Vishaka case, the court focused on failure to apply a policy, as also in the Vishaka case, failure to consider the implementation of a policy after the ratification that would give rise to the expectation of implementation of CEDAW. There was a major shift away from the Wensbury absolutist position of mere checking of fairness of procedure to scrutiny of the change of policy of non-implementation. In Rashid versus Secretary of State for the Home Department 2005, the UK Court of Appeal held there to be an enforceable legitimate expectation that the Home Office would apply in its published policy on immigration to Ms. Rashid, even though she was unaware of the policy. The European Court of Human Rights requires a reviewing court to subject the original decision to anxious scrutiny as to whether an administrative measure infringes a convention right. This is similar to the inquiry that the Supreme Court undertook in the Vishaka case, where the question was whether the failure to implement the CEDAW with relation to sexual harassment at the workplace, even though Bhamuri Devi had no knowledge of CEDAW or its ratification by India, breached an expectation as to protection from violence against women.